The marble countertop felt ice-cold beneath Serena's fingertips as she arranged the wine glasses. 8 months of working in Vincent Corsetti's penthouse had taught her exactly how he preferred things: precise, elegant, and invisible. That last part applied entirely to her. She smoothed down the black uniform dress that all household staff wore and checked her reflection on the polished surface of the refrigerator. Her dark hair was pulled back into a neat bun, not a single strand out of place. Professional, forgettable, exactly how she needed to be in a home like this. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building in Manhattan's financial district, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city that still took her breath away even after 8 months. Everything here whispered wealth. From the Italian leather sofas, the original paintings she was too afraid to Google the value of, to the sound system that probably cost more than she would make in 5 years. Miss Blackwood, Marcus Webb, head of security, appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was a solid wall of a man in his mid-40s, always polite but with eyes that never stopped assessing. "Mr. Corsetti will have 7 guests tonight. Service starts at 8. Understood." She glanced at the clock. 2 hours to prepare. Marcus hesitated, which was unusual for him. "These are important guests. Stay professional. Stay silent." Something in his tone made her stomach tighten, but she simply nodded. In 8 months, she had learned that Vincent Corsetti did not entertain often. And when he did, the atmosphere in the penthouse changed completely. Security doubled. Staff moved even more carefully than usual. She was not naive about what Vincent did for a living. You could not maintain this level of wealth and power in New York without connections that existed in shadows. But she had also learned that asking questions was the fastest way to lose a job that paid 4 times what she had made anywhere else. A job she desperately needed to keep her 17-year-old brother Ethan alive in that hospital bed, fighting leukemia with every breath he had left. By 7:30, the dining room looked impeccable. She had set the table with the black china Vincent preferred for business dinners, each piece positioned with geometric precision. The wine she had been instructed to serve was a vintage she could not pronounce, each bottle probably worth more than her monthly rent for that crumbling studio apartment in Brooklyn where rats ran freely and the heater had been broken since last winter. The guests began arriving just before 8. She stood near the kitchen entrance, hands clasped in front of her, eyes down. 5 men in dark suits entered first, their conversation stopping abruptly when they crossed the threshold. They moved with the controlled awareness of people accustomed to violence. Then Vincent appeared from his study, and as always, her traitorous heart skipped a beat despite everything she told herself. He was 36, though he carried himself with the authority of someone who held life and death in his hands. Tonight he wore a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his dark hair swept back perfectly, his gray eyes sharp as steel when they swept across the room. He was handsome in a way that felt almost dangerous, all clean lines and controlled power. She had spent 8 months trying not to notice these details, trying not to notice how his jaw tightened when he was thinking, or how his rare smiles transformed his entire face, trying not to notice him at all. The final 2 guests arrived together, and the air in the room shifted completely. The first was an older man, with silver hair and calculating eyes. The second was younger, perhaps 42, with the polished appearance of old European money. His suit was impeccable, his cologne expensive enough that she could smell it from across the room. "Lorenzo," Vincent said, extending his hand to the younger man. "Good to see you, Vincent." Lorenzo Marchetti's accent was distinctly Italian, his smile pleasant but his eyes cold as they scanned the penthouse. "You always did have exquisite taste." She moved forward to take coats and offer drinks, keeping her movements efficient and her gaze neutral. This was the dance she had perfected, present enough to serve, invisible enough to be forgotten. "What can I get you to drink?" she asked the group, her voice professionally modulated. The orders came in a blur. Scotch, bourbon, 1 request for sparkling water. She moved to the bar cart to prepare them, acutely aware of the eyes tracking her every movement. When she returned with plates of seared scallops arranged like artwork, the conversation paused. She served from the left, exactly as she had been trained, starting with the guests and ending with Vincent. His fingers brushed hers as she set his plate down, the briefest contact that sent an unwelcome jolt through her entire body. She stepped back against the wall, hands clasped, ready to refill wine or clear plates. This was her role, attentive but unobtrusive, present but not really there. The conversation resumed, shifting between English and Italian. She kept her expression blank, her posture perfect, even as she understood every single word of the Italian portions. Her grandmother, Nonna Lucia, had raised her speaking both languages after her parents died in that fire when she was 11. a fire set by debt collectors because her father had owed money to the wrong people. Nona had insisted she stay connected to their heritage, teaching her not just the language, but the regional dialect of Naples where she had been born. It had been 3 years since Nona passed away, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt and a grandson fighting for his life. Hearing Italian now felt like a knife between her ribs. Then Lorenzo leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass slowly. He switched to Italian, his words casual but sharp. "You always did have excellent taste in acquisitions, Vincent. Your home is beautiful." His eyes slid toward her in a way that made her skin crawl. "And your staff. That one is quite hot. Where did you find her? If you ever get bored, I would pay handsomely for her." Her heart stuttered violently. She kept her face carefully blank, but inside alarm bells were screaming. He had said it assuming she would not understand, reducing her to an object to be appraised and purchased. The room went absolutely silent. She risked a glance up and found Vincent staring at Lorenzo with an expression that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. When he spoke, his Italian was flawless and sharp as a blade. "She is mine." 2 words. Simple. Possessive. Absolute. Lorenzo's eyebrows rose, surprise and calculation flickering across his face. The other men exchanged glances loaded with meaning. She stood frozen against the wall, her pulse hammering in her throat so hard she could barely breathe. Vincent seemed to realize what he had said a fraction of a second after the words left his mouth. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to read, before his mask of control slammed back into place. But those words hung in the air, impossible to take back. And in that moment, Serena knew her life had just changed forever, because of 2 words from a man she had spent 8 months trying not to fall for. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves dark romance. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what happens next, because when a mafia boss claims you as his, there is no going back. The guests departed after midnight, leaving the penthouse submerged in a heavy, suffocating silence. Serena began clearing the dining room, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered wine glasses still marked with traces of lipstick. She could feel Vincent's gaze burning into her back from the hallway, but she did not turn around, focusing on her work as if her life depended on it. And perhaps it truly did. Those 2 words continued to echo in her mind. "She is mine," spoken in Italian, sharp and cold like the edge of a blade. She did not know whether Vincent realized that she had understood everything that had been said, but she knew that after tonight, nothing would ever be the same. She carried the stack of plates into the kitchen and began to wash them, letting hot water run over fingers that felt numb with cold. Steady footsteps sounded behind her, then stopped. She did not need to turn around to know who it was. "I understand Italian," Vincent said, not as a question but as a statement. Serena froze for a brief moment, the water still flowing between her fingers. Then she slowly turned off the tap, dried her hands on a towel, and turned to face the man standing only a few steps away. Vincent leaned against the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. But she did not. She had stepped back enough times in her life already. "My grandmother was from Naples," she replied, her voice calmer than she had thought possible. "She raised me after my parents died. She taught me Italian before English." Vincent said nothing for a long moment, simply watching her as if he were reading every thought inside her head. Then he asked, his voice low and dangerous, "So you heard everything Marchetti said?" Serena nodded, seeing no reason to lie. "I heard it." Vincent stepped closer, shrinking the space between them until she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with whiskey. "And you did not react. Why?" Serena met his gaze directly, and in his eyes she saw curiosity, and something else she did not dare to name. "Because I need this job more than I need my pride, Mr. Corsetti. My brother is 17 years old and lying in a hospital bed with leukemia, and I am the only one who can keep him alive. If swallowing humiliation is what it takes, then I will swallow it." The honesty of her words made Vincent pause. She saw something shift in his expression, as if she had suddenly become someone else in his eyes, no longer the invisible maid. He said nothing more, only nodded slowly and turned to leave. But just before disappearing into the dark hallway, he stopped. "You will not have to swallow humiliation for anyone in this house ever again." Then he was gone, leaving Serena alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding wildly as she realized that the way Vincent looked at her had changed completely. She was no longer invisible, and she did not know whether that was more terrifying or more hopeful. Serena reached her shabby studio apartment in Brooklyn close to 2 a.m, her legs aching with exhaustion after a long day, and she climbed 4 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for 3 months, and the landlord had not bothered to fix it. And when she opened the door, the familiar smell of dampness hit her nose, and she heard the scurrying of rats in the corner of the kitchen. Creatures she no longer feared because she had grown used to them long ago. And the apartment was barely about 20 square meters, with a rickety single bed, a rusted kitchenette, and a bathroom where the faucet only ran cold water, the heater having broken down since last winter, and now it was the middle of November, the cold seeping through every crack of the old windows. So Serena curled up in her thin blanket, still wearing her clothes because it was not warm enough to change into sleepwear, and she closed her eyes but could not sleep as the image of the fire from 13 years earlier flared up in her memory as if it had never died out. And she remembered her mother screaming her name, remembered someone's hands pulling her out through the second-floor window, remembered the smell of smoke and burning flesh she would never forget, because she had been only 11 years old when she lost her mother in that fire, a blaze that her grandmother later told her had been set by debt collectors because her father had borrowed money from people he never should have borrowed from, and her father vanished right after the funeral without a word of farewell, leaving 2 children behind for an aging grandmother. And Nona Lucia raised her and Ethan in a cramped apartment in the Bronx, working herself to the bone in a laundromat until her hands cracked and ached so badly she could barely hold an iron, teaching Serena how to cook, teaching her Italian, teaching her that no matter how poor you were, you must keep your dignity. And 3 years ago she died of lung cancer, leaving behind a mountain of hospital debt and a grandson of 14 who had just been diagnosed with leukemia. And Serena had been forced to drop out in her 3rd year of an accounting degree to work, taking any job she could find, working days at Vincent's penthouse, waiting tables at a cheap restaurant at night, and cleaning offices on weekends. 3 jobs, 7 days a week, and still, it was not enough. And the next morning, Serena went to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital before work, where Ethan lay in his hospital bed, pale and much thinner than the month before, yet his eyes still lit up when he saw his sister. "You look so tired," he said, his voice weak but full of concern. "Did you get enough sleep?" And Serena smiled, hiding the dark circles under her eyes and the skipped breakfast because she had no money left for food until the weekend, telling him she was fine. And Ethan showed her his stack of architectural drawings, sketches of buildings and bridges he spent hours drawing during the long days in the hospital, saying he wanted to study architecture when he got better, his eyes sparkling with hope, saying he would design beautiful houses for her to live in. And Serena held his hand tightly, struggling to hold back her tears as she whispered that she would definitely live in that house, even as she wondered inside whether she would have enough money to keep him alive until that day, because this month's hospital bill was already 2 weeks overdue, and the bone marrow transplant the doctor said was necessary cost nearly $500,000, a number that to Serena felt like a dream forever out of reach. In the days following that fateful dinner, Serena began to realize that something had shifted within the penthouse, because Vincent started appearing more often while she was working, something that had rarely happened before, stepping into the kitchen while she prepared lunch, or pausing in the hallway as she cleaned, and short questions began to surface. No longer the dry commands of an employer to an employee, asking whether she had slept enough one morning when he saw her cover her mouth as she yawned, asking whether she had eaten yet at midday when she declined the leftover food the chef offered. Small questions that Serena did not know how to answer, because no one had asked her such things since her grandmother passed away, so she tried to keep a professional distance, replying briefly and lowering her head to avoid his gaze. Yet she realized she was waiting for those moments, her heart beating faster each time she heard his footsteps echo across the marble floor, telling herself it was madness, that he was a mafia boss, a man belonging to a dark world she should never touch, and yet his gray eyes followed her even into her dreams. While outside the penthouse, Serena began to sense that something was wrong. The first time when she left the restaurant, after a late shift, and noticed a black sedan parked on the corner of the street, one she had never seen before, thinking little of it until she saw the same car parked near her Brooklyn apartment the next morning, followed by fleeting figures in the alley near her building, and the feeling of eyes on her back as she walked to the subway station, wondering if she was imagining things. But the survival instinct sharpened by a hard life told her someone was watching. And one evening, as she was clearing the dining room, Marcus Webb entered, looking more tense than usual, speaking quietly with Vincent in the office. And though she could not hear clearly, she noticed the way Vincent glanced toward her through the half-open door, his gaze darkening and his jaw tightening in the way she had learned was a sign of restrained anger. And that night before she left, Vincent stopped her at the door, asking whether she had noticed anything unusual lately, his voice seemingly calm, but carrying tension beneath it. And Serena hesitated for a second before deciding to tell the truth, saying there was a black car following her and someone watching her apartment, that she was not certain, but she felt it, and Vincent did not look surprised. as if he had already known what she was about to say, nodding slowly while his gray eyes regarded her with something like concern, telling her that from now on Marcus would arrange a car to take her home after every shift, and Serena was about to protest when Vincent cut her off, saying this was not a suggestion, Miss Blackwood, and for the first time Serena realized that Vincent's concern was not merely the politeness of an employer toward an employee, but that something deeper was forming between them, something she both longed for and feared, because in the world of Vincent Corsetti, concern could be a double-edged blade, and Serena did not know whether it would protect her or draw her into danger. 1 week later, Serena went to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital to visit Ethan as she always did, her heart heavy because the hospital bills were nearly a full month overdue, and she still had not managed to gather enough money, and she had prepared herself to beg the financial department for more time, even ready to kneel if that was what it took. But when she reached the reception desk and asked about the debt, the clerk looked at her in surprise and said that all medical expenses for patient Ethan Blackwood had been paid in full, including treatment costs for the next 6 months and the scheduled bone marrow transplant, and Serena stood frozen, as if struck by lightning, certain she must have misheard. "Paid in full," she repeated in a trembling voice. "But I do not have the money. I have not paid anything. Who paid it?" And the clerk checked the computer and shook her head, apologizing and explaining that the sponsor had requested anonymity, that she could only say the payment had been made 3 days earlier through a financial firm. And Serena left the desk with her mind spinning, entering Ethan's room and forcing herself to stay calm in front of her brother while her thoughts raced uncontrollably, wondering who would pay such an enormous sum for her when she had no relatives, no wealthy friends, no one in the world except Ethan, until she remembered gray eyes watching her with an unusual concern. Remembered the car arranged to take her home every night. Remembered the words, "This is not a suggestion." And she told herself it was impossible, refusing to believe it. Yet on her way to the penthouse she stopped to ask Marcus before starting work, addressing him calmly and asking whether he knew who had paid her brother's hospital bills. And Marcus looked at her for a long moment, his expression unchanged like a stone wall, telling her he had no authority to disclose that information, and that she should speak with Mr. Corsetti. And that answer confirmed every suspicion Serena had, sending heat rushing to her face, anger mixed with confusion and something else she did not want to name, so she did not bother to knock, but pushed open Vincent's office door, breaking every rule she had followed without question for 8 months. And Vincent looked up from his paperwork, gray eyes lifting slightly in surprise but not in anger, addressing her calmly as if she had simply come in to offer tea. And Serena asked why he had done it, her voice shaking as she struggled to contain her emotions, saying she knew it was him who had paid Ethan's hospital bills, and demanding to know why. And Vincent set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, studying her with an unreadable expression, asking what she was talking about, telling her not to pretend as she stepped closer to his desk with her hands clenched into fists, saying it was nearly $500,000 and asking whether he thought she would not know, insisting she did not need charity and was not a beggar. And Vincent rose slowly, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head up to meet his gaze, telling her in a low and steady voice that it was not charity but an investment in a capable employee, that she worked better when she was not worried about money, and that he needed her focused. And Serena knew it was a lie, because she saw something in his gray eyes that his words could not conceal, but she could not prove it, and did not know how to respond to the concern he was deliberately hiding behind his cold exterior. So she told him she would repay every dollar even if it took her entire life, and Vincent shrugged in a gesture of indifference she knew was false, telling her it was up to her, then turning toward the window as if the conversation were over. But Serena saw his reflection in the glass and realized he was watching her through that invisible mirror, and his eyes were nothing like his voice, because those eyes were burning. Lorenzo Marchetti was not a man who easily forgot an insult, and on the night of that party, when Vincent Corsetti uttered the words, "She is mine," in front of everyone present, Lorenzo etched that moment into his memory like a debt that would one day be collected, because he had spent years trying to uncover a weakness in Vincent, the young boss renowned for his coldness and impenetrability. And now, in a single moment of lost control, Vincent had handed him exactly what he needed: a maid. Lorenzo began investigating Serena Blackwood the very next day, sending people to follow her and learn everything about her life, from the shabby Brooklyn apartment to the 3 jobs she worked each day, from the younger brother lying in a hospital bed to the massive medical debt that had recently been paid off under mysterious circumstances. And every fragment of information confirmed what Lorenzo suspected, that Vincent Corsetti had softened because of this girl. Rumors spread through the underworld like fire racing across dry grass, Whispers exchanged in closed-door meetings and dim bars where Mafia men gathered, saying that Boss Corsetti had a weakness, that a poor maid had given a heart to a man who supposedly had none, and other families began murmuring, some curious, some contemptuous, some seeing opportunity. Marcus Webb reported all of these rumors to Vincent during a private meeting that Serena accidentally overheard while cleaning the hallway outside. Marcus's voice low and tense as he said that Marchetti was telling everyone Vincent had a weakness, that the De Luca and Moretti families were watching closely and believed he had grown weak. And Serena held her breath, waiting for Vincent's reaction, waiting for him to order all contact with her cut off, to dismiss her in order to protect his reputation. But it did not happen. "Let them talk," Vincent replied, his voice so cold that Serena felt a chill even standing outside the door. "Because I do not owe anyone an explanation for what belongs to me." Those words, "what belongs to me," echoing in her mind as Serena leaned back against the wall, her heart pounding wildly, knowing she should be afraid, should be angry at being spoken of as someone's possession. Yet instead she felt something warm and dangerous spreading through her chest, something she did not dare to name. In the days that followed, their connection continued to deepen through small, quiet moments, as Vincent began finding reasons to speak with her late at night while she cleaned, asking about her grandmother, about Naples, about the Italian dishes she knew how to cook, asking about her unfinished studies, about the dream of becoming an accountant she had been forced to abandon, asking about Ethan, about his architectural drawings, about how he remained hopeful while fighting such a brutal illness. And Serena found herself telling him everything, sharing things she had not spoken aloud to anyone since her grandmother died, speaking of her fear of losing Ethan, of sleepless nights filled with worry, of a loneliness so deep it stole her breath, while Vincent listened without judgment and without pity, simply listening with gray eyes that held something Serena was afraid to look at for too long, because she knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. Yet she could not stop. And somewhere in the shadows, Lorenzo Marchetti was watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, Serena left the restaurant after a late shift close to 11 in the evening, and the car Marcus usually arranged to take her home was nowhere to be seen, likely because she had sent a message saying she would go home on her own that night, because she wanted to walk and clear her head, needing time alone to think about what was happening between her and Vincent, about the late-night conversations that were pulling her deeper and deeper into his orbit. And the alley near her Brooklyn apartment was a shortcut she had taken every day, dark and narrow but saving her 10 minutes of walking, a path she had passed through hundreds of times without trouble. But tonight was different, because two figures stepped out from the shadows when she was halfway down the alley, blocking her path both in front and behind. And Serena stopped short as her heart began to race, immediately recognizing professionals from the way they moved, from their black suits and the trained coldness in their eyes. And Miss Blackwood, the man in front, spoke, his voice terrifyingly gentle. "Mr. Marchetti sends his regards," and Serena's heart sank as she realized she had known this moment would come but had not expected it so soon. While the man stepped closer and handed her a thick envelope, and when she opened it, she saw neatly stacked bundles of cash, more money than she earned in an entire year of exhausting work. "And Mr. Marchetti has a generous offer for you," the man continued, saying she only needed to provide a few small pieces of information about Mr. Corsetti, his schedule, important meetings, who visited the penthouse, any weaknesses she might have observed, nothing too difficult for someone as intelligent as she was. And Serena looked down at the envelope of money in her hand, then back up at the man, and asked what would happen if she refused, and the second man behind her stepped closer, his hot breath brushing the back of her neck as he said that Mr. Marchetti was very generous with those who cooperated, but that he did not like being refused, adding that her brother was in the hospital, was he not, and that it would be a shame if anything happened to him, or to her. And Serena felt the blood in her veins turn to ice as she thought of Ethan lying in his hospital bed, weak and unable to protect himself, thought of everything she had sacrificed to keep him alive, and then she thought of Vincent, of gray eyes watching her through reflected glass, of the way he had said what belongs to me without hesitation, and she dropped the envelope of money onto the ground at the man's feet and told him to tell Marchetti that she was not for sale, not to him and not to anyone, her voice trembling but firm. And then she ran, running faster than she ever had before, her heart pounding as if it would burst, her feet stumbling over the uneven pavement, not knowing whether they were chasing her, and only knowing she had to run until she reached the lights of the main street and the presence of other people. And she did not return to her Brooklyn apartment that night, instead taking a taxi straight to the penthouse, the one place a part of her knew she could feel safe. And when she appeared at the door at midnight, pale and shaking, Vincent opened it only seconds after she rang the bell. as if he had been waiting, as if he had known something would happen. And Serena told him everything, from the envelope of money to the threat against Ethan, while Vincent listened in silence, though she saw his fist clench so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and when she finished he said only one sentence, his voice low and dangerous enough to make her shiver, that from now on she would never go anywhere alone, not ever. The next morning, Vincent summoned Serena into his office, after she had spent the entire night awake on the penthouse sofa, unable to sleep as the image of the two men in the alley returned every time she closed her eyes. And when she entered the room, Vincent was standing by the window with his back to her, looking out over the city, and he spoke without turning around, saying that she would move in here, his tone not a suggestion but an order, adding that the guest room at the end of the hallway had already been prepared. And Serena felt anger flare in her chest because she had endured too much in her life, had been pushed and trampled by circumstance, but she had never allowed anyone to decide for her, so she told him she did not agree, her voice firmer than she intended, saying she had her own life and other jobs she had to work, that she could not simply move into his house as if she were an object to be stored away. And Vincent turned to face her, his gray eyes cold but with something else buried deep beneath the surface, telling her that Marchetti was not joking and calling her Serena for the first time instead of Miss Blackwood, which made her freeze, explaining that Marchetti had ordered people to follow her, that he knew where her brother was, where she worked, where she slept, that her Brooklyn apartment was not safe, and nothing in her life was safe anymore unless she stayed here. And Serena stepped closer, lifting her chin even though he was a full head taller, telling him she was not an object for him to protect, that she was not truly his no matter what he had said to Marchetti that night, and that he could not command her the way he commanded his men. And Vincent moved closer until the distance between them shrank enough for her to see the tendons standing out along his neck, asking in a low and dangerous voice whether she thought he was doing this to control her, whether she believed he had paid her brother's medical bills, arranged cars to take her home, and now wanted her here simply because he liked owning things. And Serena did not answer because she did not know why he had done those things, only that her heart was pounding so fast she could barely breathe. And Vincent continued in a voice lowered almost to a whisper that she could stay here and live, or she could return to Brooklyn and take the risk, because Marchetti would not stop just because she had refused him once. And next time it would not be a threat. Next time it could be Ethan, asking whether she wanted that to happen. And the name Ethan struck her like a bucket of cold water, making her think of her brother lying in a hospital bed, weak and unable to protect himself. And if she died, who would care for him? If anything happened to Ethan because of her stubbornness, she would never forgive herself. So she closed her eyes and swallowed the pride lodged in her throat, telling Vincent she would stay, her voice barely above a whisper, but on the condition that she had her own room, that she remained an employee, that nothing between them changed, and that this was only temporary until things calmed down. And Vincent nodded, even though his eyes said something else, agreeing that of course nothing would change, and she knew it was a lie from both of them, but she had no other choice. And that afternoon Marcus took her back to the Brooklyn apartment to collect her belongings. And as she looked at the shabby room with the broken heater and rats running in the corner, Serena realized she would not miss it, taking only a few worn clothes and her grandmother's photograph. And when she stepped into the guest room Vincent had prepared, she stopped short in the doorway, because the room was larger than her entire old apartment, with a king-sized bed dressed in white silk sheets, a walnut wardrobe, and a private bathroom with a marble tub, and she felt as if she had stepped into another world, one she did not belong to. Yet as she looked out the window at the glittering lights of Manhattan below, she wondered whether she was stepping into Vincent's world, or falling into a trap with no escape. In the first days of living in the penthouse, Serena tried to keep her distance as she had promised, waking early, working all day, and retreating to her own room the moment her duties were finished. Yet living under the same roof as Vincent Corsetti meant she could not avoid the unexpected moments, the chance encounters in the hallway, the late nights when neither of them could sleep. And it was in those moments that Serena began to see a different Vincent, the man behind the mask of the cold Mafia boss, discovering that he stayed awake until 2 or 3 in the morning every night, sitting in his office before towering stacks of paperwork and a cup of unsweetened black coffee long gone cold, sometimes standing by the window, staring out at the city with shoulders tense beneath the weight of decisions she could scarcely imagine, carrying the burden of an empire on his back and making her realize that power was never free, that it demanded a price few were willing to pay. And one night, when she could not sleep and went to the kitchen for water, she heard Vincent's voice drifting from the living room, a voice so gentle she almost did not recognize it, utterly unlike the low and icy tone she knew. And she moved quietly toward the sound and stopped at the corner of the hallway where she could see him without being seen. finding Vincent seated on the sofa with a phone pressed to his ear, and smiling, a soft and natural smile that completely dissolved the hardness of his face. As he spoke in Italian, calling his mother and asking about her garden, whether the tomatoes had ripened yet, and though Serena could not hear the reply on the other end, she saw the way Vincent leaned his head back and laughed softly at something the woman said, asking about her health, about the neighbors in Arizona, about the cat she had recently adopted, his voice carrying a tenderness Serena had never heard in anyone, least of all in a man who could order death without blinking. And when he ended the call and turned around, he saw her standing there, and for the first time, Serena saw Vincent Corsetti look embarrassed, explaining unnecessarily that it was his mother, that she lived in Arizona and had left New York after his father died, because she wanted to stay away from all of this. And Serena nodded, stepped into the living room, and sat in the chair across from him, not knowing what compelled her to do so, perhaps the smile she had just seen, perhaps the softness in his voice when he spoke to his mother, and she said that he loved his mother very much, not as a question but as a statement, and Vincent studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes softer than usual in the dim light, before answering that she was the only person who had never looked at him like a monster, that to the world he was Vincent Corsetti, the heartless boss, but to her he was only a son who needed to call more often and eat properly. And Serena smiled, truly smiled for the first time in front of him, saying that her grandmother had been the same, that to the world she was a poor orphan girl, but to her grandmother she was a granddaughter who needed to learn how to cook pasta properly and stop working herself to exhaustion. And they sat in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the quiet of two people understanding each other more than they had expected. And on the table beside Vincent, Serena noticed the open book, a work of philosophy by Marcus Aurelius, and she realized that behind the ruthless mafia boss was a lonely man who read philosophy at 3 a.m. and called his mother every week. And that realization was more dangerous than anything else, because it made her begin to see him as a human being rather than a symbol of power she should keep her distance from. That night arrived without any warning at all, and Serena had been asleep for barely 2 hours when the shrill ring of her phone tore through the silence of the room, her eyes flying open in panic, her heart already racing even before she saw the caller's name. Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, 2:17 in the morning, and her hand shook so badly she almost could not press the button to answer. And when the nurse's voice came through, it was urgent and strained, as she said that her brother was experiencing acute respiratory failure, that they were performing emergency measures, but Serena needed to come immediately, begging her to come right away. And in that instant, Serena's world collapsed, because she did not remember whether she ended the call or what she put on. She only knew she was running out of the room barefoot with her heart in pieces, racing down the hallway until she slammed into something solid, not a wall, but Vincent, who was still awake, still wearing a rumpled white shirt, and heading back from his office, and his hands caught her shoulders to keep her from falling. And when he saw her face, pale and streaked with tears and so panicked she could not form words, he did not ask a single question, and she whispered only one word before her throat closed completely. "Ethan," and Vincent nodded once with certainty, calling out Marcus in a voice that echoed through the penthouse like a command, telling him to bring the car to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital immediately, and everything that followed unfolded like a dream Serena could not control. As she sat in the car with Vincent beside her, the city sliding past the window in blurred streaks of light, her body trembling uncontrollably and frozen to the bone despite the heater running, until she felt Vincent's hand close around hers, warm and steady, and he said nothing, offered no empty comfort or promises that everything would be fine. He simply held her hand, and somehow that meant more than any words ever could, and at the hospital everything dissolved into chaos of harsh lights, doctors moving quickly, and voices Serena could not process because her mind was spinning, as Ethan was rushed into the emergency room, and no one allowed her to follow, leaving her standing outside the closed doors, staring through the small window, and praying to any force willing to listen, begging them not to take him, whispering that he was all she had left while tears ran down her face unnoticed, and Vincent stood beside her the entire time, silent and solid like an unyielding shadow. And when her legs began to shake so badly she could no longer stand, he guided her to the cold waiting chairs and sat beside her, his shoulder touching hers, his presence quiet but undeniable, as doctors came and went, and every time the emergency room doors opened, Serena's heart clenched in terror, hearing fragments of updates and uncertain answers, that they were doing everything they could, that his condition was still critical, that she needed to wait patiently. And she did not know how long she sat there, 1 hour, 2 hours, or the entire night, because time lost all meaning when the person she loved most was fighting for his life behind those doors, and at some point she realized her head was resting against Vincent's shoulder and that his arm had come around her back without her noticing. And she knew she should pull away, should keep the distance she had sworn to herself 100 times, but she could not, because she needed his warmth, needed the feeling that someone was beside her in the longest night of her life. And Vincent was there, not out of obligation, and not because she was his employee, but for something else neither of them dared to name. And when dawn finally tinted the New York sky pink through the hospital windows, Dr. Catherine Chen stepped out at last, exhausted but carrying the news Serena had prayed for all night, saying that her brother was out of immediate danger, that the night had been severe but he was a fighter, that he would need the bone marrow transplant sooner than planned, but for now he was stable. And Serena broke down, not with sobs but with the choked cry of relief, of fear finally released after hours of terror, and without thinking she collapsed against Vincent's chest, and for the first time he pulled her fully into his arms, holding her as she cried, his hand gently stroking her tangled hair. And she did not know how long they stood like that, only that when she finally lifted her head and looked into his gray eyes, she saw that something had changed, not between them, but within her. Because the wall she had built to protect herself had fallen, and she no longer wanted to rebuild it. 1 week after the night Ethan nearly died, the bone marrow transplant was performed, and Dr. Catherine Chen had found a compatible donor far sooner than expected. And Serena knew it was no coincidence, because she did not ask Vincent whether he had anything to do with it since she already knew the answer, knowing he had the connections that could turn the impossible into reality, and that he had used them for Ethan and for her. And on the night of the surgery, Serena sat alone in the hospital waiting room because she had insisted Vincent stay away, telling him he had important work and that she could not keep leaning on him forever. Yet when the clock struck 10 at night and the operating room doors remained closed, she saw him walk into the waiting room carrying 2 cups of hot coffee, telling her that she truly thought she could give him orders and that she should know by now it never worked. And Serena could not stop the small smile that curved her lips, even as anxiety continued to gnaw at every nerve in her body. And Vincent sat beside her, and they waited in silence, the comfortable silence of 2 people who no longer needed words to understand one another, until close to midnight, when Dr. Chen finally emerged, still in surgical scrubs, and visibly exhausted, but smiling as she said, the surgery had been a success, that Ethan's body was responding well to the new marrow, that he would be monitored closely over the coming weeks, but that she was very optimistic, calling Ethan a fighter. And Serena heard nothing after the word success, because she leapt to her feet, her mouth opening without sound as her throat closed tight, tears spilling freely now. Not tears of fear, but of pure happiness she had not dared to hope for in months. And she turned to Vincent, and without thought or calculation threw herself into his arms, clinging to him with all her strength, her face pressed to his chest as tears soaked his expensive shirt, and she did not care, whispering brokenly that Ethan would live, that he would live, and Vincent held her back, his arms locking around her as if afraid she might disappear, whispering into her hair that he had told her so, that the kid was strong, his voice low and carrying a smile she could feel. And she lifted her head to thank him, or perhaps to say something else entirely, but when her eyes met his gray eyes all words vanished. Because he was looking at her with something she had never seen before, filled with longing and tenderness and something far deeper, and she realized their faces were only inches apart, and that his breath was warm against her cheek. And she knew she should step back, should remember who he was and how dark and dangerous his world truly was, but she did not move. And Vincent kissed her. A kiss, not gentle like those in the love stories she once read, but desperate, heavy with months of restraint and long nights of wanting her without daring to touch, his mouth hot against hers as she kissed him back with everything she had kept buried for so long, and they kissed there in the quiet hospital corridor at midnight, as if the rest of the world no longer existed, until reality crashed down like icy water, and Serena pushed Vincent away and stepped back with eyes wide in horror, not because of the kiss, but because she realized she had fallen in love with him, that she loved a mafia boss, a man with blood on his hands and a world steeped in darkness, and she whispered that this should not be happening, her voice trembling as she apologized and said she could not, turning and running toward the stairwell without looking back, because she was afraid that if she did she would not be able to leave, and because she was terrified that it was already too late to walk away at all. In the days after that kiss, Serena became a ghost within the very penthouse she now lived in, waking before dawn and leaving her room while Vincent was still asleep, working in the farthest corners of the apartment, and retreating to her room the moment she heard his footsteps echo across the marble floor, avoiding his gaze as if it were fire, because every time she looked into those gray eyes, She remembered the feel of his mouth on hers, and the way her heart had raced as if it might burst, and she knew with a terrifying certainty that she was in love, and that was precisely why she had to run. Because at night, lying alone in the luxurious room she still could not grow accustomed to, she told herself again and again that she had lost her mind, that Vincent Corsetti was a mafia boss, a man who could order a life ended as easily as ordering breakfast, a man who belonged to a world of violence and blood and darkness, of secrets she never wanted to know, and loving someone like that was not love but self-destruction. So, she thought of her mother who had died in a fire because her father owed money to dangerous men, thought of her grandmother, who had spent her entire life trying to keep Serena far away from the underworld she was now running toward, thought of Ethan who was slowly recovering and needed a stable future, not a sister falling into the arms of the Mafia. Yet every time she tried to convince herself of these truths, Vincent's memory returned. The night he sat beside her in the hospital for hours without complaint, the way he held her hand when she was afraid, steady and warm, the tenderness in his voice when he spoke to his mother, the philosophy book on his night table, the way he asked whether she had eaten with genuine concern in his eyes, and she remembered the man behind the cold mask, the man perhaps no one else in the world ever saw but she had, and Vincent did not pressure her, he did not seek her out, did not demand explanations, did not try to speak of that kiss. He gave her space, and yet somehow his presence was everywhere, because one morning a book she had once mentioned wanting to read appeared on the table in her room. One afternoon Marcus informed her that a car was always ready to take her to see Ethan whenever she wished. One evening she found a plate of food set out on the kitchen table with a handwritten note saying she needed to eat properly, and with a tremor in her chest, Serena realized that he was waiting. That Vincent Corsetti, a man accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, was waiting for her to come to him in her own way, and that frightened her more than if he had forced her, because this patience and this quiet care proved that what she felt in him was real, that behind the Mafia boss was a man with a heart, and that heart was turned toward her, and standing before the bathroom mirror, staring at the dark circles beneath her eyes and her hollowed face after so many sleepless nights, Serena knew she could not keep running forever, yet she did not know how to stop and face what was happening in her heart, because she loved him, and that love might very well destroy her. 1 week later, when Serena went to the hospital to visit Ethan as she always did, she did not expect the past she had tried so desperately to bury to catch up with her in the most brutal way, because the moment she stepped out of the hospital gates, a familiar black sedan pulled up to the curb and the rear door opened, and Lorenzo Marchetti stepped out with a polite smile, as if they were old acquaintances meeting by chance on the street, addressing her softly in a tone that was frighteningly gentle as he said he thought they should talk, just the two of them. And Serena wanted to run, but her feet felt nailed to the ground when she saw the two large men standing behind him, blocking every possible escape, knowing that screaming or resisting would only make things worse, especially since they were standing right outside the hospital where Ethan lay inside, and she did not dare imagine what Lorenzo might do to her brother if she refused to cooperate. And Lorenzo calmly suggested they talk at the small cafe across the street, pointing it out and assuring her it was public and crowded, and that she would be perfectly safe, saying he only wished to share a few interesting pieces of information he thought she would want to know. And Serena had no choice but to nod and follow him, sitting at a table by the window where she could see the busy street outside, as Lorenzo ordered 2 espressos and waited until the server left before speaking, asking whether she knew why he was interested in her, saying it was not because Vincent Corsetti had foolishly declared her to be his, but because of her last name, Blackwood, which stirred old memories. And Serena felt the blood in her veins slow as he continued, mentioning Michael Blackwood, her father, in the same casual tone one might use to read a weather report, calling him a pathetic gambler buried under massive debt, explaining that 16 years earlier, he had borrowed money from the Marchetti family to cover his gambling losses and then tried to run without repaying it, foolish enough to think he could deceive them. And Serena's heart pounded so violently she felt nauseous, because her grandmother had never told her the details, only that her father had made a terrible mistake and paid the price. And Serena had always believed he died in the fire along with her mother, until Lorenzo looked at her with cold eyes and said that the house fire that year had been set by his men, not with the intention to kill anyone but merely as a warning, though things had spiraled out of control and her mother had not been so lucky, and Serena's world shattered piece by piece, as a ringing filled her ears and the room seemed to spin, because the men who worked for Lorenzo had killed her mother, not by accident or fate but as punishment for her father's debt. And then Lorenzo leaned forward and lowered his voice as if sharing a secret, saying that her father had not died in that fire at all, that he had escaped before the flames took hold, abandoning his wife and 2 small children to save himself, and that he was still alive somewhere out there. and Serena whispered no, her voice barely more than ragged breath, unable to accept it, while Lorenzo continued mercilessly that her father had left them there to die, calling him a wonderful father with bitter irony, and then added that now Serena was in love with a man who belonged to the very world that had killed her mother, saying that Corsetti and Marchetti were simply two sides of the same coin, that Vincent's hands were stained with blood no less than his own. Asking whether she truly believed Vincent was clean or different, and Serena shot to her feet as the chair crashed to the floor, unable to speak or think clearly, knowing only that she had to get away from the words tearing her apart from the inside, and she ran out of the cafe and into the street without knowing where she was going, aware only that the world she thought she understood had completely collapsed because her mother had been murdered. Her father was a coward who abandoned his family, and Vincent, the man she loved despite all her efforts to deny it, belonged to the very world that had taken her mother from her, and she did not know how she would ever face him after learning all of this. Serena stormed back into the penthouse like a force of nature, pushing open the door to Vincent's office without knocking, not caring that Marcus was standing just outside or how many rules she was breaking, because rage and pain were burning her from the inside and she needed answers. She needed the truth. And Vincent looked up from the stack of papers, his gray eyes narrowing when he saw her face, rising at once and moving toward her with clear concern, asking what had happened, but Serena shouted back that he dared to say her name as if he cared, her voice cracking under the weight of it all, accusing him of knowing everything from the beginning, about the fire, about her father, about Marchetti, of knowing and saying nothing, and Vincent stopped short, something passing through his eyes, not of surprise, but of realization that the secret had finally been exposed, signaling Marcus to leave and waiting until the door closed before turning back to her and asking who had told her, his voice low and taut, and when she said Lorenzo Marchetti's name she stepped closer, tears spilling despite her efforts to stop them, telling him that Marchetti had told her everything, about her father's debt to the Marchetti family, about the fire set by his men, about her mother being killed, about her father still being alive and having fled while his wife and children burned, her voice breaking as she demanded to know how long Vincent had known, and Vincent closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering strength, admitting that he had known before he ever hired her, that he investigated all employees, that he knew about the fire, the debt, the connection between her family and his world, and Serena felt as though she had been punched in the stomach, asking then what it all was, whether he hired her out of pity, guilt, or a sense of responsibility toward a debtor's daughter. But Vincent stepped closer and stopped when she recoiled, telling her no, that he hired her because she was qualified, because she needed the work, and because her background showed no ties to Marchetti that could endanger him, admitting that he did not know her father was alive and only discovered that after Marchetti began investigating her, and Serena asked through pain why he had not told her. Why he had not told her who killed her mother, when he knew about the fire and Marchetti. And Vincent looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes filled with something like grief, saying he wanted her to come to him for who he was, not because he could help her seek revenge or find her father, that he wanted her to see him, not use him as a means to an end, confessing after a breath that he was selfish, that for the first time in his life he wanted someone beside him, not for power or money or what he could provide, but because they chose him, because they wanted him. And Serena stood there with tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking in more ways than one, angry at his deception, shattered by what Lorenzo had revealed, and lost because even now, even knowing he had hidden the truth from her, she could not stop loving him, whispering that she did not know what she was supposed to feel, whether she should forgive him or hate him, only that she needed time, needed to think. And Vincent nodded without trying to touch her or stop her, telling her he would wait, however long it took. And as Serena turned and walked out of the office, Vincent's voice stopped her just before the door closed, telling her there was one thing she needed to know, that whatever her past with Marchetti was, he was not him, that he was not the man who killed her mother and would never hurt her. And she paused for a moment without turning back, then kept walking, knowing she needed time to decide whether she could believe him. Serena could not sleep that night, lying on her bed, staring up at the ceiling in the darkness, as her mind spun with what Lorenzo had revealed and what Vincent had confessed, knowing she needed more, needed to understand who the man she had fallen in love with truly was before she could make any decision at all. And close to 2 a.m, she rose and walked toward Vincent's office, where she knew he was still awake, warm yellow light spilling through the cracked door and the faint sound of a glass being set down on a table reaching her ears, and she knocked lightly before stepping inside without waiting for an answer, to find Vincent seated on the sofa by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, the city lights glittering behind him like millions of fallen stars, and he did not look surprised to see her as if he had known she would come, saying quietly that she could not sleep, not as a question, and she replied that she needed the truth, all of it, about him and about what he had done, telling him that Marchetti said his hands were bloody too and that she needed to hear it from him. And Vincent studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to open the door to the darkest part of himself before finally nodding, setting the whiskey down and turning fully toward her as he began in a low, distant voice that 8 years earlier his father had been assassinated inside their family home in the suburbs, 3 bullets to the chest while he was eating breakfast, that Vincent had been 28 years old, freshly graduated and preparing to take over part of the family's legitimate business, never imagining he would be forced into that world in such a way, and Serena sat motionless, afraid to breathe lest she break the moment. As Vincent continued that the man who ordered his father's murder was his own uncle, his father's brother, who wanted control of the Corsetti family, and believed that with his father gone it would be easy to push aside a young nephew, asking if she could imagine being betrayed by one's own blood, and Serena thought of her father abandoning her and Ethan to save himself, and realized she understood that feeling more than Vincent knew. And when she asked what he had done, Vincent answered plainly that he had killed him, not ordering anyone else and not hiring a killer but doing it himself, wanting his uncle to see his face as he died, and to know that the nephew he had dismissed was the one ending his life. And the room grew so silent Serena could hear her own heart pounding as Vincent stared down at his clenched hands, and went on to say it was not the only time, that in 8 years of leading the Corsetti family, he had done many things she would never be able to accept, that he had ordered deaths and carried them out himself, that there was more blood on his hands than he could count, that he was not clean, and never could be, lifting his eyes to hers with a pain and honesty that stole her breath as he said he had killed people. More than one, that he was exactly what she should run from, the darkness her mother had died because of even if not by his hand, and that if she were smart she would leave and never look back. And Serena felt tears slide down her cheeks, but did not wipe them away, searching his eyes for something to tell her what to do next, until he spoke again with a slight tremor, as if these words were harder than any confession of murder, telling her that with her he wanted to be better, that he did not know how but wanted to try, that he did not deserve her yet could not let her go, not because he owned her but because for the first time in his life he was afraid of losing someone. And Serena looked at him and saw the man behind the Mafia boss, saw the truth in his gray eyes, and for the first time she did not know whether she should stay or run. Serena did not leave that night, nor did she say that she forgave or accepted what Vincent had confessed. She only nodded, stood up, and returned to her room with a heart weighed down by thoughts she could not yet untangle, needing time that Vincent gave her. And 2 days passed in a tense silence in which Serena continued to work and remain in the penthouse while she and Vincent barely spoke, though she could feel his gaze following her and sense the patience mixed with worry in the way he watched her from a distance, waiting, while she still did not know what her answer would be. And on the 3rd night, Serena decided to visit Ethan at the hospital later than usual because she needed to see her brother, needed to be reminded of why she had endured everything from the beginning, and knowing Marcus would never allow her to leave without a full security detail. Yet her phone had buzzed moments ago with a text message, seemingly from Dr. Chen, saying Ethan had collapsed, and she needed to come alone immediately if she wanted to see him, and panic overrode all caution as she made a decision that would become the greatest mistake of her life, slipping out through the kitchen service elevator she knew from her days as a maid, running blindly into the night driven by the terror of losing her brother, because the moment she stepped into the hallway leading to Ethan's room, everything happened too fast for her to react. A hand clamped tightly over her mouth from behind, the sharp smell of chloroform flooding her senses, and the world collapsing into darkness before she could scream. And when Serena woke, she was lying on an icy concrete floor in a dark basement, her hands bound behind her back with rope pulled so tight that her wrists were bleeding, her head throbbing as if struck by a hammer. And as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she realized where she was, her heart nearly stopped, because this was not a hospital, this was hell. And then she heard it, the sound of anguished screaming coming from the room next door, a voice she recognized instantly, Ethan, her brother, the child who had just undergone a bone marrow transplant, screaming in pain somewhere nearby. And Serena tried to cry out, but her throat was dry, and only a weak rasp escaped, struggling against the ropes only to feel them bite deeper into her skin as tears streamed down her face, with each scream of Ethan's echoing like a blade cutting into her heart, until the basement door opened, and harsh light forced her to squeeze her eyes shut. And when she opened them again, Lorenzo Marchetti stood before her with a smile as cold and poisonous as a serpent, addressing her with revolting politeness and apologizing for the rough welcome, explaining that she had refused his offer, and he was not accustomed to being refused. And when Serena whispered Ethan's name and begged him not to hurt her brother, reminding him that Ethan had just had surgery and needed medication, Lorenzo nodded with feigned concern and said they had stopped the boy's painkillers, a terrible shame, because he seemed to be suffering greatly, but that everything now depended entirely on Vincent Corsetti, as Lorenzo crouched in front of her, gripping her chin and forcing her to meet his eyes while telling her he had sent a message to her lover, that Vincent had 24 hours to surrender all territory south of Manhattan and withdraw from every operation in New York, or Ethan would die first, and then Serena would follow. And as Lorenzo rose and walked toward the door, he expressed hope that Corsetti would be smart enough to make the right choice, because he did not enjoy wasting lives, though he would not hesitate if necessary. And when the door closed and darkness swallowed the room once more, Serena fought to steady herself despite the violent trembling of her body, remembering the bracelet Marcus had fastened around her wrist weeks earlier, supposedly a gift from Vincent, and now bound in the dark with her brother screaming in agony. Next door, she remembered the way Marcus had insisted she wear it at all times, because the bracelet carried a GPS tracker, still tight against her wrist beneath the ropes, and she needed only to hold on long enough, because Vincent would find her. He had to find her, because if he did not, then both she and Ethan would die in that basement, and Lorenzo Marchetti would win. Vincent received the GPS signal from Serena's bracelet less than an hour after she disappeared, because Marcus had set up the tracking system the moment Lorenzo began making threats, and now it was saving her life, the signal leading to an abandoned warehouse in the outskirts of New Jersey, one of the locations the Marchetti family used for things they did not want anyone to know about. And within 20 minutes, Vincent mobilized his entire force, despite fierce objections from his advisors who warned that this could be a trap, that he should not risk everything for a maid and her sick younger brother, that he could negotiate or find another way. But Vincent did not listen, looking at Marcus with eyes cold as steel, and saying only one sentence: "Prepare to move. We strike now." And the raid began at 4 a.m, while darkness still covered everything, and Lorenzo's men were at their most careless, with Vincent leading the assault himself despite Marcus's furious protests that he should stay behind, because Vincent refused, needing to find Serena with his own hands, needing to see her alive with his own eyes, and gunfire tore through the night as Vincent's men flooded the warehouse from every direction, and a short but brutal battle erupted, Vincent cutting through every obstacle, shooting down anyone who stood in his way, with the ruthless precision he had honed over 8 years at the head of the Corsetti family, until he found Serena in the dark basement, her hands bound behind her back, her wrists bleeding, her face pale but her eyes lighting up the moment she saw him, whispering his name through tears and choking out that Ethan was in the room next door and needed to get to the hospital immediately. And Vincent cut the ropes and pulled her to her feet as Marcus reported over the radio that they had found Ethan, the boy in critical condition after a relapse triggered by stress and lack of medication, followed by another report that Lorenzo Marchetti was fleeing out the back with 2 bodyguards. And Vincent froze for a single heartbeat, facing a choice he knew would define who he truly was, because he could chase Lorenzo now and end the threat forever, eliminate the enemy who had endangered her and her family and ensure this never happened again. Or he could let Lorenzo escape and get Ethan to the hospital immediately to save the boy's life, knowing he could not do both, and that time would not allow it. And Serena looked at him with eyes full of tears and terror, not begging and not speaking. Yet he read everything in her gaze, understanding that Ethan was all she had and that her brother was dying just feet away while Lorenzo was escaping. And Vincent made his decision, ordering over the radio without hesitation to let Lorenzo go and get the boy into the car immediately, to Brooklyn Methodist Hospital as fast as possible. And Serena stared at him in disbelief, realizing he had just let his greatest enemy escape to save her brother, that he had chosen her and Ethan over power and his own safety. Because some things matter more than power, Vincent said as if reading her thoughts, guiding her out of the dark basement. And in that moment, Serena finally understood that this man loved her, not with words, not with money or protection, but with actions, because he had chosen her, and that choice meant more than any declaration of love ever could. Ethan survived, and Dr. Catherine Chen worked through the night to stabilize his condition, announcing the following morning that he was out of immediate danger, that his body was responding well to the medication, and that although he would need more time to recover, he would be all right. And Serena sat by Ethan's bedside for 2 full days without leaving for even a moment, while Vincent came to visit each day but never stayed long, standing quietly at the doorway, asking if she needed anything, then leaving when she shook her head, giving her the space he had promised, though she knew he was waiting and she also knew she could not hide forever. As word spread through the underworld that Vincent Corsetti had allowed Lorenzo Marchetti to escape in order to save a maid and her brother, and other families whispered that the Corsetti boss had grown weak, that he had allowed emotion to rule his decisions, with some beginning to eye his territory with open hunger, all of which Vincent knew. Yet he felt no regret, and on the third day, when Ethan was awake and strong enough to speak, Vincent came to the hospital room with an offer, standing beside Ethan's bed and looking at Serena with gray eyes, heavy with exhaustion from too many sleepless nights, as he said he could arrange a new life for her and Ethan anywhere she wanted. Europe, California, anywhere at all. With new identities, enough money that she would never need to work again, and lifelong security, explaining that although Marchetti had fled New York, he still held influence, and that she and Ethan would be safer if they no longer had any connection to him. And Serena looked at Vincent and understood exactly what he was doing, that he was giving her an escape, placing her safety above his own desires, willing to let her go even if it would destroy him. And in that moment she knew she was not going anywhere. And Ethan spoke up in a weak but determined voice, asking to speak to his sister, and telling Mr. Corsetti he thought he should step outside for a moment. And Vincent studied the boy before nodding and leaving the room. And once the door closed, Ethan took Serena's hand and asked her directly whether she loved him, his eyes far older than his years. And Serena did not answer because her silence was answer enough. And Ethan told her she had spent her whole life running, from poverty, from the past, from pain, and that she should not run from this, reminding her that Vincent had saved him, that he had let his enemy escape to save a boy like him, asking how many people in the world would make that choice, and Serena cried. For what Lorenzo had done to them, for the terror of nearly losing her brother, and for the love she had tried to deny for far too long. And then she wiped her tears, kissed Ethan's forehead, and stepped out into the hallway where Vincent stood with his back against the wall and his head bowed, lifting his eyes when he heard her and revealing the expectation of pain there as he prepared for her to say goodbye. But instead Serena stepped close until only inches separated them and told him she was done running, that she had run her entire life from poverty, from the past, from her own feelings, but she did not want to run anymore, placing her hand against his chest and feeling his heart racing beneath her palm as she told him she was staying, that she chose him. And then she kissed him, not the desperate kiss of before, and not a kiss she would flee from afterward, but a kiss of choice and commitment and love she no longer wished to hide. And this time she did not run away at all. 1 year passed like a dream. Serena had never dared to dream. As she completed her accounting degree at the university she had been forced to abandon 4 years earlier, with Vincent's support but through her own effort, and she took charge of the finances for the charitable foundation Vincent established to help families with loved ones suffering from critical illnesses, a foundation named Lucia, after her grandmother, while Ethan made a full recovery and began his first year studying architecture at Columbia, his eyes lighting up whenever he spoke about the buildings he would one day design. And although Lorenzo Marchetti had not yet been found, his influence had weakened significantly, as many allies turned their backs on him, and Vincent consolidated his position, proving that compassion was not weakness, until one September morning, Vincent announced they would take a 1-week trip to Italy, which Serena accepted without suspicion, thinking it was simply a holiday after a turbulent year. But when the plane landed and she realized they were on the Amalfi Coast, her heart tightened, because her grandmother had been born in Positano, a small village clinging to cliffs above the Mediterranean Sea, a place her grandmother had told her hundreds of stories about, of sunsets turning the water to gold, of lemon blossoms and salty air, of the small house where she grew up before emigrating to America, a place Serena had never thought she would see until now. Realizing Vincent had brought her to her grandmother's homeland, and they spent the week exploring the Amalfi Coast, walking narrow, winding roads, eating fresh pasta and drinking local wine, watching sunsets from tiny cafes perched above the sea, with Vincent different here, more relaxed, smiling more, as if the distance from New York allowed him to set down the weight he carried. And on the final night, Vincent took her to a small restaurant on a hilltop overlooking the Bay of Naples, their table set on a private balcony surrounded by bougainvillea and candlelight, as the sun sank and painted the sky in bands of orange, pink, and violet, reflected across the water below. The most beautiful sight Serena had ever seen, making her believe the night could not possibly become more perfect, until Vincent stood, walked around the table, and knelt before her, stopping her heart, drawing out a black velvet box and opening it to reveal a deep blue sapphire ring, the color of her eyes, of the Amalfi sky at sunset, of the dream they were living, and Vincent spoke in a low voice, trembling in a way she had never heard before, saying that a year earlier he had declared she was his before Lorenzo, without understanding why. And now he did, because part of him had recognized her importance in that moment, before he knew her real name, before he knew she understood Italian, before he knew she would change his life completely, pausing to breathe before admitting he was not perfect and might never be entirely clean, but promising to strive every day to be worthy of her, to protect her, love her, and choose her above everything else as he had and always would, looking into her eyes with love and hope and asking if she would truly be his and he hers forever. And Serena cried without wiping away the tears because they were tears of happiness she had never believed she deserved, nodding before speaking aloud so he could hear her say yes, yes I will, as Vincent slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, kissing her beneath the Amalfi sunset, where her grandmother had been born and dreamed of all her life. And in that moment Serena knew she had finally found home. The wedding took place on a November afternoon at the Corsetti family estate in the suburbs of New York. Not in the luxurious Manhattan penthouse, but in the house where Vincent's father had grown up, where his grandmother once tended a garden and taught him that family mattered more than any empire. And they kept the ceremony intimate with only 40 guests, the closest and most trusted people in their lives, as Ethan walked Serena down the aisle with steady, confident steps, nothing like the frail teenager who had lain in a hospital bed 2 years earlier, wearing a suit Vincent had helped him choose and looking more grown and handsome than ever, whispering to her as they waited at the entrance that she looked beautiful, not in the way a brother was obliged to say it, but truly beautiful. And Serena smiled as she smoothed her champagne-colored wedding dress with its simple, elegant cut, no long train and no elaborate details, just a quiet refinement that reflected who she was. While Vincent's mother, Maria Corsetti, had flown in from Arizona for the wedding and embraced Serena tightly that morning, tears shining in her brown eyes so much like her son's, telling her that her son had never looked at anyone the way he looked at her, as if Serena were both the anchor that kept him grounded and the wings that allowed him to fly, thanking her for loving him even knowing everything. And the ceremony unfolded in the garden beneath an arch of white roses and green leaves, with Vincent waiting for her in a perfectly tailored black suit, though what took Serena's breath away was his expression, because the gray eyes that were usually guarded and hard to read were open and gentle now, filled with unhidden love, and their vows were simple and sincere, promises to choose each other every day, to build together, to be honest even when honesty was difficult, without flowery language, only truth spoken before those who mattered most. And when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Vincent kissed her with care and passion, Serena hearing Ethan whistle from behind them and sending everyone into laughter, and the reception became an evening of dinner and dancing under warm golden lights as the sun set, with Maria dancing with her son, tears streaming down her face as she made peace with the life he had chosen, even if she could not be part of it every day, and Ethan charming the older ladies with his intelligence and easy humor, proof that he had fully recovered. And 2 years later, Serena stood in the office of the Lucia Charitable Foundation, reviewing quarterly financial reports. The volunteer support program at Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, having expanded to 4 additional hospitals and helping hundreds of families survive the nightmare of medical bills, her accounting degree finally serving its true purpose. While Ethan was in his 2nd year at Columbia, his architectural drawings now professional in quality as his dream steadily took shape, and late afternoon sunlight streamed through the office window as Serena felt the familiar kick in her belly, stronger than in previous weeks, 7 months pregnant, and her daughter clearly determined to remind her mother of her presence every minute, whispering for the baby to calm down as she rubbed the small foot or elbow pressing outward and telling her mother was trying to work, only to hear Vincent's voice from the doorway, amused, saying the baby had inherited her personality, stubborn and demanding attention. And Serena turned her chair to look at her husband, his hair slightly longer now, a few silver strands at his temples and faint lines of worry around his eyes from the burdens he carried. Yet when he looked at her and at what they were building, those lines softened into contented smiles, and when she asked how the meeting went, as he approached and instinctively placed his hand on her belly, he said it went well, that they had finalized a Brooklyn real estate project to build affordable housing with ground-floor commercial space for local businesses, kneeling beside her chair to speak to her belly, and telling their daughter that her mother had structured the finances to make the project truly sustainable, and that her mother was very smart, making Serena laugh as she told him not to talk to her stomach because it was strange, only for him to reply that the baby needed to hear her father's voice because all the books said so, his hand moving in gentle circles as he added that he was thinking of reading to her that night, perhaps architectural history to amuse Ethan, and Serena stroked his hair, overwhelmed by the love she felt for the man who had transformed from a dangerous mafia boss into a partner and a soon-to-be father with such sincere commitment. And when Vincent softly said he had never thanked her, and she asked for what, he answered for the fierce honesty she showed him in the kitchen that night, for being exactly who she was in that moment, because that act of bravery had started everything, revealing something he had not yet admitted to himself, and leading them here. And he looked around, encompassing not just the office, but everything they had built. The foundation helping thousands, Ethan thriving, Serena, their daughter, and tears filled Serena's eyes without her caring, because these were tears of joy and fulfillment, and a love she had never believed she deserved. And when Vincent repeated softly to her belly that she was his, echoing the fateful words from that night long ago, Serena smiled and replied that she was his, but that he was hers too, forever. And as Vincent kissed her, Serena knew that from the ashes of the past, from tragedy and loss, from darkness and danger, they had built something worthy. Not a perfect fairy tale, but a real life with scars and hard choices, and also with love and hope, because Vincent had transitioned 60% of his operations to legitimate business with plans to increase that to 80% within the next 2 years, building a legacy their daughter could be proud of. Not an empire rooted in shadows, but a future founded on redemption and change. And that was the most beautiful thing Serena had ever witnessed. A story that teaches us the past does not define the future, that people can change when they find a reason strong enough to change, that true love is not possession but a choice made every day, and that no matter where we come from or how many wounds we carry, we all deserve love and can rebuild our lives from the ashes. And if you enjoyed this story, please press like and share it with those who love romantic stories. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you do not miss our daily videos. Tell us how you feel about Serena and Vincent's story, and whether you believe people can truly change for love. Share your thoughts in the comments, because we would love to hear what is in your heart. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we wish you good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye and see you again in the next video.